James Carter had always prided himself on being a family man. For years, he rose before dawn and worked long hours as a construction foreman, driven by the thought of providing for his wife, Laura, and their bustling household of 5 children. Yes, the number was staggering, but James never saw it as a burden. Each child represented a piece of the life he and Laura had built together, a chaotic, love-filled home where laughter drowned out the looming threat of unpaid bills. The financial strain wasn't new. Between the mortgage, loans for the family van, and an ever-growing grocery bill, it sometimes felt like they were on the brink of collapse. But James had always believed they could weather any storm together. Laura, with her sharp wit and warm smile, was his anchor. Or so he thought. On a rainy Tuesday evening, James was sent home early from a business trip due to an unexpected cancellation. The long drive back was filled with thoughts of his family. He imagined the kids rushing to greet him, Laura's eyes lighting up when she saw him at the door. The idea warmed him, helping him ignore the ache in his back from weeks of hard labor. But when he pulled into the driveway, his chest tightened. A sleek black sports car sat parked in his spot, gleaming under the porch light. James frowned. They couldn't afford anything like that. Confused, he climbed out of his truck, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots feeling unnaturally loud in the quiet. As he approached the house, he was greeted not by the usual din of children, but by muffled laughter, a man's deep chuckle. James's pulse quickened, unease curling in his stomach. He hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. Inside, the familiar warmth of home felt off. The living room, once cluttered with toys and mismatched furniture, was impeccably tidy. The family photos that had lined the walls were missing, leaving behind pale rectangles where the paint hadn't faded. The faint scent of cologne, sharp and unfamiliar, hung in the air. "James," a voice called, sharp and surprised. Laura emerged from the kitchen, barefoot and draped in a silk robe. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, details that stood out to James because they were so unlike her usual sweatpants and ponytail look. Behind her, a man appeared. He was tall, muscular, and younger, with a smirk that immediately set James's teeth on edge. "You're back already?" Laura said, her tone more irritated than welcoming. James blinked, stunned. "What's going on here?" "Who is this?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The man leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "I'm Trent," he said, as if that explained everything. His tone was smug, his gaze challenging. "And you're trespassing." "Trespassing?" James repeated, his voice rising. He looked to Laura, his wife, the mother of his children, searching for some explanation. But she didn't meet his eyes. "James," Laura said, sighing like she was scolding a child. "You don't live here anymore." The words didn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" "This is my house." "No, it's not," she said firmly, stepping closer. "Not anymore." Her dismissal hit him like a physical blow. He looked past her, into the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of his kids. "Where are the children?" "I want to see them." "They're asleep," she lied smoothly. "You'll just upset them if you stay. It's better if you leave now." James clenched his fists, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "I'm not leaving until you explain what the hell is going on." Trent pushed off the doorframe and stepped forward. "You heard her, old man. Get out. This is our house now." "Our house?" James stared at the man, then at Laura, his mind racing. "Laura, what is he talking about?" "James," she said, her voice dropping into a warning tone. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just go." The finality in her voice shattered something inside him. For a moment, all he could do was stare, his mind struggling to comprehend the depth of her betrayal. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. He sat in his truck for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The rain pattered against the windshield, matching the turmoil in his chest. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but he ignored it. How had his life fallen apart so suddenly? Eventually, he found himself on the other side of town, parked outside Kyle's small apartment. Kyle had been his best friend since high school, the kind of guy who never judged and always had a cold beer waiting. When James knocked, Kyle answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his expression turning to concern when he saw James's face. "What happened?" Kyle asked, stepping aside to let him in. James sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "Laura, she kicked me out." Kyle frowned, closing the door. "What are you talking about?" "Why? She's with someone else. Some guy named Trent." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Kyle cursed under his breath. "Man, I'm sorry. I don't even know what to say." James shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Kyle. My wife, my kids, they were everything. And now, it's all gone." Kyle placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, James. We'll figure this out." But as James sat there in the dim light of Kyle's living room, clutching his phone and replaying Laura's words in his mind, he wasn't sure if anything could be fixed. His home, his family, his entire life, it all felt like it had been ripped away in an instant. And worst of all, he had no idea why. Weeks passed, but the shock of that night never left James. His once orderly life felt like a distant memory. Nights on Kyle's couch turned into a routine as James tried to piece together what had gone wrong. Every attempt to contact Laura about the kids was met with silence. His calls went unanswered, and texts were ignored. His hands were tied legally. Without a court order, he couldn't just show up and demand access to his children. It was during one of those restless nights that James's phone buzzed with an email notification from the bank. Half asleep, he opened it and froze. The message congratulated him on the approval of a $250,000 loan. Panic set in as he read further. He hadn't applied for a loan. How could he? His credit was already stretched thin. Fumbling with his phone, James called the bank first thing the next morning. After hours of navigating hold music and transferring departments, he finally reached a representative. "Sir," the woman on the line explained, "the loan application was submitted with all the necessary documentation, including your signature. If you're disputing this, we'll need proof that you didn't authorize it." James's stomach dropped. "Signature? I didn't sign anything. This is a mistake." "I understand your frustration," the woman said, her tone detached, "but unless you can provide evidence, the loan and its repayment fall under your responsibility." James sat in stunned silence. Someone had forged his signature. His mind immediately went to Laura. Fueled by anger and desperation, James drove straight to his former house. The sleek black sports car was still in the driveway, its presence mocking him. His knock on the door was loud and insistent. After a few moments, the door swung open, and there was Laura, looking annoyingly unbothered. "What now, James?" she asked, her arms crossed. James held up his phone, showing her the email. "You want to explain this? A $250,000 loan in my name?" Laura glanced at the screen, then shrugged. "Not my problem." "What do you mean, not your problem?" James's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "You forged my signature, didn't you?" Laura smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "So what if I did? We needed the money. You're the one who left us with nothing while you were off working all the time." James stared at her, dumbfounded. "You think this is justified? You've jeopardized everything we've worked for. And where's that money going, Laura? Because it's not on the kids." At that, her smirk faltered for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of defensiveness. "Don't lecture me, James. You're not a part of this family anymore. Whatever mess this loan is, it's your responsibility to deal with. Before James could respond, she slammed the door in his face. But not before he heard it, crying. The unmistakable sound of one of his children sobbing. He pressed his ear to the door, and a male voice barked something unintelligible inside. More crying followed, along with Laura's voice trying to calm the situation. James felt his chest tighten. His children were in there, miserable, while she played house with a stranger. Something inside him snapped. This wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was neglect. He needed to act, not just for himself but for his kids. That night, James contacted a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn. Her reputation for uncovering the truth made her the perfect ally. "Leave it to me," she said after hearing James's story. "If there's dirt to dig up, I'll find it." Days turned into weeks as Evelyn conducted her investigation. James stayed in contact with her, each update adding another layer to the nightmare that had become his life. "Your hunch was right," Evelyn said during one of their phone calls. "Laura forged your signature for the loan. I've got the documentation to prove it. She used the money to pay off some of her personal debts, but most of it went straight into Trent's bank account." Trent's? James's knuckles tightened around the phone. "Yep," Evelyn continued. "And you'll love this, Trent has a history. He's got 2 prior convictions for fraud, including one for scamming another family out of their savings. He's using your house as his latest base of operations." James felt his blood run cold. "What about the kids? Are they okay?" Evelyn hesitated. "I went by the house a few times. From what I've seen, the kids aren't being properly cared for. They look unhappy, and I've overheard arguments, mostly Trent yelling at Laura. The neighbors have noticed too, but no one wants to get involved." James's grip on the phone tightened. "How is this happening? How can she let this guy around our kids?" "She's in too deep, James," Evelyn said gently. "She's chosen him over everything else. But don't worry. We're going to get this sorted. I've got all the evidence you need to take this to court. Fraud, neglect, everything." James spent that night poring over the documents Evelyn had sent. Each piece of evidence felt like a dagger. Bank statements showing the money trail from the loan to Trent's account. Photos of his children, their faces pale and weary. Witness accounts from neighbors who'd seen the once lively household descend into chaos. He thought about Laura's cold dismissal, Trent's smug face, and the cries of his children behind that locked door. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about getting back at Laura anymore. It was about protecting his kids and reclaiming the life they deserved. James wasn't a man who backed down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. James had never been one for revenge, but this wasn't just about him anymore. His kids were stuck in a toxic environment, neglected and suffering, while Laura and Trent lived off his hard work. Every sleepless night on Kyle's couch, every tear-filled memory of his children, fueled his resolve. It was time to fight back, and win. He began by organizing everything Evelyn, the private investigator, had uncovered. She delivered more than James could have hoped for: forged documents, bank statements proving Laura's fraudulent loan application, and photos of Trent's suspicious activities. The piece de resistance. Trent's Achilles heel, his tangled web of tax fraud. "Turns out Trent hasn't paid taxes in years," Evelyn said during one of their meetings. She slid a folder across the table. "This guy's been skimming off every scheme he's pulled. The IRS will have a field day once this gets out." James thumbed through the papers, a grim satisfaction settling over him. "This is enough to take him down, right?" "More than enough," Evelyn assured him. "But timing is everything. You want the whole house of cards to fall at once. We'll make sure of that." James's next step was gathering first-hand accounts from people who knew the family. He started with his neighbors. Most were hesitant at first, no one wanted to get involved in a domestic dispute, but as James shared glimpses of the evidence he'd collected, their attitudes shifted. "You always worked so hard for those kids," Mrs. Allen, the retired teacher from across the street, said with a shake of her head. "I've seen how things have changed since you left. The little ones hardly play outside anymore, and when they do, they look so sad. It's not right." One by one, James earned the support of his community. Neighbors provided statements about the changes they'd noticed in Laura's behavior and the deteriorating condition of the children. Some even admitted to hearing late-night arguments, Trent's booming voice laced with curses. James also reached out to the kids' teachers. Mrs. Conway, his eldest daughter's math teacher, was particularly concerned. "Lily used to be one of my brightest students," Mrs. Conway confided during a coffee shop meeting. "But lately, she's been withdrawn. Her grades have slipped, and she's come to school looking like she hasn't slept or eaten properly." James clenched his fists under the table. "She's my daughter. I won't let this continue. Will you help me?" Mrs. Conway nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. Just tell me what you need." Meanwhile, James kept an eye on Laura and Trent's activities through Evelyn. "They're getting cocky," Evelyn reported one evening. "Trent's been spending that loan money on luxury items. Watches, electronics, trips, all under your name, of course. He's practically begging to be caught." James smirked bitterly. "Good. Let him dig his own grave." But Evelyn wasn't done. "I also found something else, something you might be able to use. Trent's been hosting card games at your house. High-stakes poker with some less than savory characters. If one of them talks, it could blow this wide open." James's stomach churned. The idea of criminals sitting at the same table where his kids once did their homework filled him with rage. "Let's make sure one of them does talk," he said, his voice steely. Building the case wasn't just about legal proof, it was about painting a complete picture of the harm Laura and Trent had caused. James documented everything meticulously, creating a timeline of events that detailed their betrayal, the neglect of the children, and Trent's crimes. Kyle helped him organize the files. They spent countless nights at the kitchen table, spreading papers across every available surface. "You've got them, James," Kyle said one night, gesturing to the mountain of evidence. "There's no way they can worm their way out of this." James nodded, but his determination was tempered by a deep sadness. "I just want my kids back, Kyle. I don't care about the house or the money. They're all that matters." James had learned patience in his years as a foreman, overseeing complex projects that required meticulous planning and timing. Now, that same discipline guided him as he set the final stages of his plan into motion. It began with the anonymous tip Evelyn sent to the IRS, a quiet spark that would soon ignite Trent's carefully constructed life of lies. Within weeks, the consequences of Trent's financial crimes began to unfold. Federal agents conducted a quiet investigation, combing through the records Evelyn had provided. Trent's fraudulent tax filings and suspicious bank transactions left a trail so obvious that even he couldn't talk his way out of it. Then, one crisp Friday morning, James received a call from Evelyn. Her tone was triumphant. "It's happening, James. They're at the house." James drove to the neighborhood, parking a safe distance away, and watched as federal agents swarmed his former home. Trent, clad in a tank top and gym shorts, was escorted out in handcuffs. His cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of bewildered panic. Neighbors gathered, murmuring in shock as agents carried boxes of evidence out of the house. James felt a grim satisfaction. Trent had strutted around that house like he owned it, but now the truth was plain for all to see. The fallout was swift and brutal. News of Trent's arrest spread quickly, splashing across local headlines. His history of scams, the unpaid taxes, and his use of James's stolen funds to finance his lavish lifestyle were laid bare. But Trent wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Laura's role in the schemes didn't go unnoticed. Reporters dug into the story, uncovering the fraudulent loan application and the neglect that had left the Carter children struggling. Laura, once proud and dismissive, now found herself the subject of judgment and whispers. James didn't waste the momentum. With Evelyn's help, he filed for sole custody of his children, presenting the mountain of evidence they'd collected. Neighbors, teachers, and even the pediatrician testified to Laura's neglect. Evelyn's photographs of the children's hollow faces and Laura's forged documents sealed the case. The courtroom was tense during the custody hearing. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid but calm, while Laura fidgeted nervously across the aisle. She looked far from the confident woman who had smirked at him weeks ago. The pressure of Trent's arrest and the weight of her own actions had taken their toll. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, addressed the court. This case involves serious allegations, including financial fraud, neglect, and the endangerment of minor children. We will hear all evidence before making a decision. Laura's lawyer attempted to defend her actions, painting her as a struggling single mother overwhelmed by circumstances. But the evidence was too damning. James's lawyer, a sharp and relentless advocate named Helen, presented the facts with precision. "Your Honor," Helen began, holding up a folder, "this is the loan application bearing Mr. Carter's forged signature. Mrs. Carter used these funds not to support her children but to finance the extravagant lifestyle of a known fraudster." Helen then gestured to the photos of the children. "These images were taken during this period. Note their malnourished appearances, the lack of proper clothing. This was not the result of hardship, it was the result of neglect." James's heart ached as he watched the photos flash on the screen. His kids, once bright-eyed and full of energy, looked worn down and defeated. He stole a glance at Laura. She stared at the table, her face pale. Finally, Helen called James to the stand. He spoke with quiet intensity, recounting the betrayal, the discovery of the loan, and the cries he'd heard behind the locked door that night. "All I want," James said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "is to give my children the life they deserve. A safe home. A stable home. They deserve better than what they've been through." The judge nodded thoughtfully before calling Laura to the stand. Laura's testimony was a disaster. When pressed about the loan and Trent's involvement, her answers wavered between deflection and desperation. "I didn't know it would get this bad," she stammered. "Trent said he'd handle everything." "And the children?" the judge asked, her tone sharp. "Why were they left in such a state?" Laura's lip quivered. I was overwhelmed. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Her excuses rang hollow in the face of the evidence. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that Laura had lost the court's sympathy. The judge's ruling came swiftly. In the matter of custody, it is the decision of this court to award sole custody of the Carter children to Mr. James Carter, she declared, her voice firm. Furthermore, Mr. Carter shall retain sole ownership of the family home, as it is clear that Mrs. Carter's actions have jeopardized the financial stability of this family. Laura's gasp echoed through the courtroom. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she simply shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The judge continued, her tone unyielding. "Mrs. Carter, the evidence of fraud and neglect presented here will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review. You may face further consequences for your actions." With a resounding bang of the gavel, the hearing was adjourned. James stepped outside the courthouse, where Kyle and his kids were waiting. When they saw him, the children ran to him, their small arms wrapping around him tightly. Tears welled in his eyes as he hugged them all, overwhelmed by relief and love. "It's over," he whispered to them. "We're going home." The following day, James returned to the house with his kids. The locks had been changed, and every trace of Laura and Trent was removed. The space felt different, lighter, safer. That evening, as the kids unpacked their things, James stood in the doorway of the living room and allowed himself a moment of peace. He'd reclaimed his home, his family, and his life. Laura was gone, Trent was behind bars, and his children were finally safe. But more than anything, James felt hope. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a battle, it felt like a beginning. James Carter stood in the doorway of his house, a place that had once been a battleground of betrayal. Now, it was quiet, not the silence of neglect and despair, but the gentle hum of peace. His children were scattered throughout the home, settling back into the spaces that had been theirs all along. The echoes of Trent's voice, Laura's dismissive laughter, and the heavy tension that once filled the air were gone. It had been weeks since the court's ruling, and James's life had become a blur of tasks. Every morning began with purpose, waking the kids, preparing breakfast, and driving them to school. Afternoons were spent organizing the household, repairing the damage left behind, and selling off unnecessary belongings to chip away at the mountain of debt. The changes were slow but steady. The children began to smile more. Laughter returned to the home, though it was hesitant at first, as if they were testing whether it was safe to be happy again. One of the first things James did was enroll his kids in therapy. The neglect they had endured under Laura's care had left its mark, and James knew he couldn't undo the damage on his own. Lily, his eldest daughter, was the most guarded. She'd taken on the role of protector for her younger siblings during the chaos, and now she struggled to let go of that burden. "I should have done more," she confessed during one of their sessions. "When Mom and Trent were fighting, I tried to keep the little ones in our room, but I couldn't always stop them from hearing." James's heart broke as he listened. "Lily," he said gently, "you did everything you could. You were just a kid, and none of this was your fault. Now it's my turn to take care of you." Her tears were the first step toward healing, and James made a silent vow to give her and the others the security they deserved. The house itself underwent a transformation. James and the kids worked together to repaint the walls, covering the faded colors and scuff marks with fresh, vibrant shades. The furniture was rearranged, toys and books were brought back into the open, and photos of the family were returned to their rightful places. On Saturdays, they tackled the yard. Weeds were pulled, flowers planted, and the grass trimmed. James even repaired the old swing set, much to the younger kids' delight. It was more than just home improvement, it was reclamation. "This house is ours now," James told the kids as they sat on the newly cleaned porch one evening. "No one else's. And we're going to make it the best home it can be." The financial recovery was slower, but James was determined. Selling Trent's extravagant purchases had brought in some much-needed cash, and James had negotiated with the bank to restructure the loan. It was a daunting task, but he faced it with the same resolve that had carried him through every other challenge. Kyle, ever the loyal friend, pitched in where he could. "You've got this, man," he said one evening over a beer. "I've never seen anyone work harder for their family. They're lucky to have you." James smiled, a rare moment of pride breaking through his usual humility. "I'm lucky to have them," he replied. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, James and the kids gathered on the porch. The day's work was done, and they sat together, enjoying the cool breeze and the quiet rhythm of their newfound life. Lily leaned against the porch railing, her gaze thoughtful. "Dad," she asked hesitantly, "do you think she'll ever come back?" The question hung in the air, the weight of it pressing against James's chest. He thought about Laura, the woman he had once loved, and the choices that had led her down a path of destruction. "Maybe," James said after a long pause, his voice steady. "But if she does, we'll be ready. We've built something stronger here, something no one can take away." His words seemed to reassure her, and she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The children found their rhythms again, excelling in school and making friends. James found joy in the small moments, helping with homework, cooking dinners that left the kids laughing at his clumsiness, and tucking them into bed each night with a sense of accomplishment. One afternoon, as he sorted through a box of old papers, he found a photo of their family from years ago. They were all smiling, arms wrapped around each other, the weight of the world nowhere in sight. He stared at it for a moment, then placed it on the mantel beside a new photo, one taken just last week, after they'd finished repainting the house. The smiles in the new photo weren't as carefree as the ones in the old, but they were real. Earned. James often reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The betrayal, the pain, the fight for justice, it had tested him in ways he never imagined. But it had also shown him the depths of his own strength and the unbreakable bond he shared with his children. Dad, his youngest son, Charlie, asked one night as James tucked him into bed. "Yeah, buddy. Are we going to be okay now?" James knelt beside him, smoothing back his hair. "We already are, Charlie. And we're going to keep getting better. I promise." Charlie's sleepy smile was all the reassurance James needed. As the seasons changed, the Carters found themselves creating new traditions. Sunday movie nights, backyard barbecues, and family game nights became staples of their routine. The house, once a place of chaos and sorrow, had become a haven of love and laughter. And James, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed himself to feel hope. As he stood on the porch one evening, watching the stars blink into view, he realized that he no longer thought of the house as the place where he'd been betrayed. It was the place where he had rebuilt. And that, he knew, was the truest redemption of all.